And the more you try to build something without God, for your own idols or for yourself, ultimately it will fall apart. And everything that they have built is now ashes, rubble. Because they attempted to build something as the people of God that was not for God. They copied, they mimicked, they imitated all the other societies that were driven by other values, the values of greed and power and pleasure. And the glory of God and the good of people were not the values by which they built. And God demolished it. Just as He will demolish all societies ultimately that build those sorts of cities. Okay, so these people are in deep grief. So this gives us some hope, because here are people in utter grief. Grief like some of us will never know. Absolutely devastated. And God says, I've got good news for you. Can you be rehabilitated? Can you be restored? Yes, you can. Will God restore them? Yes, I will. And so now we come to looking at, how does God do this in this passage? What does He tell us, and what can we learn about restoring joy when we have this fear that we will never be restored or repaired? Well, it says in verse 1, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. The Lord's Spirit, or the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord, is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach the good news. A lot of people have asked themselves, well, who is this person? Is it Isaiah, or is it someone else? And the point here is, first of all, that God's plan of restoration, God's plan or program of rehabilitation, all centers, all is on the shoulders of one person. Now that is a basis for some joy. Okay, even if you're not feeling much joy at the moment, that's a basis for some joy. Because in a sense, the expectation is not on you. It's on this person. This person carries the weight of the rehabilitation. Many of us, we lose our joy because we really deep down think that God is expecting you to repair yourself. That's how rehabilitation usually works. If you go to a rehab center, say you've been a drug addict, people will help you, but you've got to do the work. You're the one that's got to fix yourself up. But here, the emphasis is not upon the people. It's upon this person. This person, he bears the responsibility, and God's expectations are not on the people, they're on him. He has to do it. He has to succeed. Who is this person? Is it Isaiah? No. Actually, Isaiah's already given us clues as to who this person is, and he does it through this very first verse. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me. What that means is that God has empowered him for the work. When you see the anointing, it means that God has chosen this person and gives him the Spirit of God to empower him, to enable him to do this great work. And Isaiah's already mentioned who that person was. He's talked about this person before in earlier sermons in his book. Back in Isaiah chapter 11, he says that on the root or the descendant of Jesse will be given the Spirit of the Lord. If you have a Bible with you, just turn to Isaiah chapter 11. Verse 1. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, and his roots, a branch, will bear fruit. And here we have it. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and power, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. So on this root of Jesse, which means on this son of Jesse, on this descendant of Jesse, the Spirit of the Lord will rest. So there'll be some son, some descendant of Jesse, who was the father of David. So it's a shorthand way, or another way of saying, on one of the sons of King David of Israel, there will come a person whom the Spirit of the Lord will be on him in a very special way, like no other human person has ever experienced. And the Spirit of the Lord upon this son, this descendant of King David, will be empowered with wisdom and understanding and counsel and power to accomplish his great work. And what is his great work? Well, if you look at verse 4, but with righteousness he will judge the needy, with justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. What Isaiah is saying is this one will be empowered to restore law and order in the world, to return the world back to the way it should be under God. And God's rule will now be properly established through the world by this person, and he is empowered to do it. It's the same person that's referred to even earlier in Isaiah chapter 9, where you have those verses that we sometimes sing as a Christmas song. For unto us a son is born, the son of David. Unto us a child is given, and his name will be Wonderful. Okay? And he goes on to give a string of titles. Counselor, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This great ruler will restore righteous, just government in the earth. And it says that. And of the increase of his government there will be no end. That person in chapter 9 is the person who is given the Spirit of God to do this in chapter 11, who is now referred to in chapter 61. So there's no doubt about it. People who keep saying, I wonder if this is Isaiah, aren't listening to Isaiah, because Isaiah is giving you the clues. And he's telling you clearly, this is going to be the great ruler, the great Messiah, because the word Messiah means anointed one. Okay? So it's the Messiah, the great restorer. But notice too the way in which he does that. If you turn back to chapter 61, you'll notice it says he's come to proclaim. He's come to bind up the brokenhearted. He's come to proclaim freedom. He's come to proclaim the year of the Lord. This Messiah, his initial and primary work will be to preach. He will be a preacher. And when the restorer comes, you will know he's come because he will be a great preacher. And what he preaches will inspire and liberate people. It will heal their hearts. It will give them hope where they've never had hope before. And it will give them hope because it will tell them that God is now with them. This preacher will give them a message from God that tells them that God is going to liberate them. God is going to forgive them. God is going to restore them. And if you notice in verse 2, it says to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's the idea of the Jubilee. In Israelite law, there was a year of God's favor. It was every 50 years. And every 50 years in Israel, this was to happen. There was to be a proclamation or a declaration that whoever had debts, they were forgiven. And whoever was serving somebody else to repay their debt was set free. That's what he's saying here. This great ruler restorer is going to come and he's going to proclaim God's favor. He's going to say, whatever you owe, you're forgiven. Your debts are completely forgiven, and your servitude to others or to God to repay your debt is what? You are free. And he's going to preach that message. He's going to preach it as good news. Now, there was someone who came after Isaiah who did a lot of preaching, who preached God's favor of forgiveness and of freedom, and who was very conscious that the Spirit of the Lord was on him. Who was that person? Hello? Come on, big voice. Jesus. Yes, thank you. It's a good name. Jesus. I mean, that's the Sunday school answer, isn't it? It's always about Jesus. And Isaiah's telling you again, it's about Jesus. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jesus at his baptism, and he was empowered to do this great preaching work. And he went about preaching. And he said, I've come to preach. So Jesus was very conscious he was this person. So much so that even when he went to his hometown, he read this passage. And he said to them, today this is fulfilled in your presence. And people were so infuriated they wanted to stone him. But he had no doubts about himself. He was fully confident, I'm this guy. This is me. I have the Spirit of the Lord to do this work. There's another method that is used, and we find it in verse 3. He not only preaches, but he substitutes. He replaces. Notice, he's come to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes. They have ashes, but he gives them his crown of beauty. The oil of gladness instead of mourning. What can they give him? They give him their mourning. What does he give them? His oil of gladness. A garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They give to him their despair. He gives to them a garment of praise. So they come looking like wretched, miserable people in tatters, representing what their life is like. And he reclothes them because they now have a new status and new privileges. They're free. They are children of God. They're restored to God. And he replaces it. He replaces what they have with what he can give. Now, already that gives you the way you've got to deal with Jesus. You've got to listen to his preaching. He said, if you want to know his fullness of joy, you must abide in his word. You must be regularly taking in and listening and fully accepting and believing what he tells you. That this is the truth from God. And secondly, you give him your problems, he gives you his solutions. You give him your mourning, he gives you a garment of praise. You give him yourself, and he will replenish and replace you. Again, John 15, that's the idea of the vine. If you're sick, if you're despairing, then there can only be one reason, according to this passage, and that is you are not being replenished in Jesus. You're in a sense trying to go it alone. You're trying to repair yourself with what you have, with your own resources, and they're inadequate and insufficient. But the importance of these two methods of preaching and replacement is that it identifies this great ruler, restorer, with someone else that Isaiah talks about. And if you've studied Isaiah, you will know this person. There's another person that Isaiah talks about in his sermons, and he's called the servant, or the suffering servant. And it's interesting, but when you read the suffering servant passages in chapter 42, in chapter 49, and in chapter 50 and 53, and they're listed in the newsletter, so you can go home and look at them. When you read those passages, you think this is a different person. He's not a mighty king, he's a suffering servant. He's being mistreated, abused by people, and he's seen such a kind and gentle person. So he can't be the great king who's going to restore justice in the world because he's suffering injustice. But the amazing thing is the suffering servant does exactly the same thing. He uses words, he preaches, he teaches, and he replaces, and he substitutes. He does exactly the same work as this king. And what's Isaiah telling you? It's the same person. That's why we sing that song, the servant king. The king is the servant, and the servant is the king, and they both do exactly the same work. The servant, through his suffering, it says, will also restore justice and righteousness, if you read those passages. He does exactly the same work.